If you had told me, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, that a stranger with more money than God would walk into my son's hospital room and change everything, I would have laughed in your face, not because it sounded impossible, but because in my life, help never just walked in. You fought for it. You begged for it. You worked 3 jobs and slept 4 hours a night for it. But that's exactly what happened. And before I tell you how, I need you to sit with 3 questions, because I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll have every single answer. Why was a billionaire standing in the pediatric ICU that day, and what did he want with a stranger's dying son? What did I overhear 3 weeks later that made me realize this so-called chance encounter was never chance at all? And 6 months after the doctor told me my son had 6 months to live. Is he still breathing? Stay with me. Because this isn't just his story, or mine. It's the story of what a mother will do, what she'll swallow, what she'll fight, what she'll risk, when the only thing that matters in the entire world is one small, stubborn heartbeat. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Maren, and this is what happened to my son. I need you to understand something about my son before I tell you the rest of this. Eli isn't just my son. He's the reason I get out of bed at 5 in the morning. He's the reason I've said no to men who seemed nice enough, because nice enough wasn't the same as safe enough, and safe was the only thing that mattered once he came into the world. He is, without exaggeration, my entire life. Every plan I've ever made, every dollar I've ever saved, every prayer I've ever whispered into a dark room, all of it has his name on it. He has this laugh that comes from somewhere deep in his belly, like it surprises even him. He collects rocks, not shiny ones, not the kind you'd buy in a gift shop, ordinary gray ones, the kind most people would walk right past. He tells me each one has a story, even though he's the one making the story up on the spot. He has gapped front teeth and a cowlick that no amount of water will tame, and when he wraps his arms around my neck at bedtime, I forget, just for a second, how tired I am. His father left before Eli turned 2. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because you need to understand what single mother actually meant in my house. It didn't mean occasional, it meant only. There was no one else's name on the birth certificate that mattered. No one else picking him up from daycare when I picked up a double shift. No one else lying awake at 3 a.m., Googling fevers. His father didn't just leave the marriage, if you could even call it that. He left the boy. Walked out the door one October afternoon and never once looked back. No calls on birthdays, no cards at Christmas, nothing. So I made a decision, somewhere in that first brutal year of doing it alone, that I would love Eli enough for 2 parents. That whatever hole his father left, I would fill it with everything I had, even if it meant I had nothing left over for myself. I worked the breakfast shift at a diner off Route 9, and 3 nights a week I mopped floors in the hospital cafeteria after visiting hours ended. I wasn't glamorous. I didn't have savings, or a nice car, or a man to split the bills with. What I had was Eli, and a stubborn kind of love that didn't know how to quit. People used to tell me I was pretty, in a way that surprised them, like they expected someone worn down, and instead got someone who still smiled easy, who still had soft eyes even under the fluorescent diner lights. I never thought much about it. Beauty wasn't something I had time to consider. I had a boy to raise. It was a Tuesday in early spring when everything cracked open. Eli had been tired for weeks. Not normal kid tired, tired in a way that scared me. He'd stop halfway up the stairs to catch his breath. His lips would go a strange shade of blue-gray after he ran even a little. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things, because the alternative was terrifying, and terrifying wasn't something I had room for on a waitress's schedule. Then one afternoon he collapsed getting off the school bus. I don't remember driving to the hospital. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I remember praying out loud like a crazy person, please, 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 over and over, like if I said it enough times it would become true. The next few hours are a blur of white coats and machines, and a word I'd never heard before that afternoon, and now will never forget. cardiomyopathy, a rare form, aggressive. His heart, the doctor explained, was failing. Not someday, not eventually, but now, quietly, every single day, a little more. I remember the doctor's face when he said it. He had kind eyes and a voice that had clearly delivered this kind of news before, which somehow made it worse. He said the words, 6 months, like they were a fact of weather, like he was telling me it might rain. I don't remember what I said back. I remember the floor tilting. I remember Ruth, my best friend, the only person in this world besides Eli who has never once let me down, catching my arm before my knees gave out completely. What I remember most clearly, though, is walking into Eli's hospital room after they'd gotten him settled, seeing him small and pale against those enormous pillows, an IV taped to the back of his little hand, and him looking up at me and saying, "Mommy, don't cry. I'm not scared if you're here." I have never in my life had to work so hard to smile. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat in the hallway outside his room and called every insurance number I had. I was told, in that flat corporate voice designed to make you give up, that the treatment his cardiologist wanted to try, an experimental procedure only offered at a handful of hospitals in the country, was not covered. Experimental, not proven, financial risk to the company. I remember laughing, this awful, hollow laugh, because they were talking about risk like it was a spreadsheet number and not my son's actual heartbeat. I hung up the phone in that hallway and put my face in my hands and let myself cry the way I hadn't let myself cry in front of Eli. Quiet, ugly, alone. That's the state I was in, raw, wrecked, invisible in the way exhausted people become invisible in hospital hallways, when I first saw him. He didn't look like he belonged there. That was my first thought. Not because of the suit, though the suit alone would have turned heads in a hospital full of scrubs and sneakers. It was something quieter than that, a stillness, like grief he'd worn so long it had become part of his posture. I found out his name later, Thane Ashford, but that night, in that hallway, he was just a tall, tired-looking stranger standing outside a room 3 doors down from Eli's, staring at a closed door like it owed him an answer. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Rich people came through this hospital sometimes. Donors, board members, the occasional visiting specialist flown in on somebody's dime. I had no reason to think he had anything to do with me, except he looked at me. Really looked, the way most people in that hallway didn't, because most people in that hallway were too wrapped up in their own private disasters to notice anyone else's. He looked at my swollen eyes, at the exhaustion I'm sure was written all over me, and something in his face shifted, like he recognized the specific shape of what I was carrying. "Rough night?" he said, quiet, not fake friendly, not pitying, just human. I remember laughing, that same hollow laugh from the phone call, and saying something like, "You could say that." He didn't push. He didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. He just sat down on the bench a few feet from where I was standing, like he understood that some nights, the kindest thing a stranger can do is simply not leave you alone in a hallway. We didn't talk about anything important that first night. I didn't tell him about the diagnosis, or the insurance call, or the 6 months hanging over my son's head like a blade. He didn't tell me why he was there, standing outside a room that, I'd learn much later, had nothing to do with a sick relative of his own, at least not one who was still alive. I went back in to sit with Eli. When I came out an hour later, Thane was gone. I told myself it didn't matter. I had bigger things to think about than a stranger in a hallway. I had a boy whose heart was quietly failing, and a treatment I couldn't afford, and a mountain of fear I was climbing alone, same as always. But he came back the next night, and the night after that. At first I was suspicious. You learn to be, when you've spent your whole adult life being the only person responsible for keeping your child alive. I wondered if he wanted something. I wondered if this was some strange kind of hospital small talk between two people orbiting the same grief. I didn't let myself hope for anything, because hope, in my experience, was expensive, and I'd already spent everything I had. But slowly, over those quiet hallway conversations, something happened that I wasn't prepared for. He made me laugh. Actually laugh, not the hollow kind, for the first time in weeks. He asked about Eli, and when I talked about him, about the rocks he collected and the laugh that came from his belly, Thane listened like it mattered. Like Eli mattered, to a man who had no reason to care about either of us. I didn't know yet what he'd lost. I didn't know that somewhere underneath that composed, expensive exterior was a man carrying his own 6-month countdown from years before, one that hadn't ended the way mine still might. He kept that part of himself locked away, and if I'm honest, I liked the mystery of him. It gave me something to think about besides the machines beeping in my son's room. What I didn't expect, and couldn't have predicted, was what happened 3 days later. I was in the hallway again, this time on the phone with the insurance company, for what felt like the 100th time, my voice cracking as I begged a stranger on the other end of the line to understand that this wasn't a spreadsheet. This was my son. I hung up, shaking, humiliated in that particular way that comes from begging and being refused anyway. And when I turned around, Thane was standing there. He'd heard the whole thing. "Don't," I said, before he could say anything. "Please don't offer me pity. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime." "It's not pity," he said, and there was something in his voice, steady, certain, like he'd made a decision long before that moment, that made me believe him, even though I had no idea yet what that decision was, or why a stranger would make it for a woman he barely knew. I want to be honest with you about something. When help finally came, I almost refused it. 2 days after that hallway conversation, Eli's cardiologist called me into his office with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, something close to disbelief. He told me that the experimental procedure, the one my insurance had flatly denied, had been fully funded, not partially, fully, every cost, every travel expense, every follow-up appointment, covered by an anonymous donor. My first feeling wasn't gratitude, it was suspicion, sharp and immediate. Nothing in my life had ever been free, not once. Every kindness I'd ever received had come with strings, spoken or unspoken, and I had a young son I needed to protect from anyone who might think generosity gave them a claim on either of us. I marched straight to Thane. I didn't even bother being polite about it. "Was this you?" I demanded. He didn't lie to me. I'll give him that. He never once lied to me, not in the entire time I knew him. "Yes," he said simply. "Why?" My voice broke on the word, and I hated that it did. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. I don't need—" I stopped, because the truth was, I did need it, desperately, and both of us knew it, and there is nothing quite as humiliating as needing something you have no way of refusing. "I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you," he said. His jaw was tight, like he was holding something back, some deeper reason he wasn't ready to hand over yet. "I'm doing it because your son deserves a chance. That's all I can tell you right now." I wanted to push. Every instinct in me wanted to know why, what a man like him could possibly have to do with a diner waitress and her sick little boy. But Ruth, when I called her in tears that night, torn between pride and desperation, said something that stuck with me. "Maren," she said, "you have spent 7 years being too proud to ask for help, filling every gap in that boy's life all by yourself because nobody else would. This isn't about you anymore. This is about Eli. Let someone carry this with you, just this once." So I did. God help me, I did. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn until weeks later, in a moment I never should have overheard, was that Thane's reasons went far deeper than simple generosity. He had a sister, younger than him by 6 years, bright, funny, the kind of person who filled up a room, he told me much later. She'd been diagnosed with the exact same condition as Eli when she was 24, and in a hospital much like this one, a version of Thane much younger and much less powerful had sat in a hallway just like this one and watched doctors tell him there was nothing more they could do. She died 11 months after her diagnosis. Thane built his entire empire in the years that followed, and quietly, without press releases or foundations bearing his name, he had spent a decade finding sick children whose families couldn't afford the fight he'd once been powerless to give his sister. He never told me that easily. He kept it locked away like it cost him something every time he came close to it. But I started to notice things. The way his eyes would go somewhere far away when Eli laughed a certain way. The way he'd go quiet whenever I mentioned how scared I was of losing my son. I didn't understand it yet. I only knew that whatever pain lived behind his composed, expensive exterior was real, and it was old, and it was the reason, somehow, that he'd walked into our lives at all. I need to tell you about the worst night of my life. Not the diagnosis, not the insurance denial. This. It happened 2 weeks before the procedure was scheduled. Eli had been improving, or so we thought. Color back in his cheeks, energy enough to argue with me about bedtime, which felt like the sweetest kind of miracle after everything. Then, without warning, his heart monitor began screaming in the middle of the night. I don't have words for what it's like to watch a team of doctors surround your child's bed, calling numbers back and forth to each other in a language you don't understand, while you stand pressed against the wall because you're in the way, because there's nothing useful your hands can do. I have never felt so powerless. I have never understood so completely what it means to love someone more than your own life and be unable to save them with that love alone. Thane came. I don't know how he knew. I hadn't called him. I hadn't called anyone except Ruth. But he was there within the hour, and he stood beside me in that hallway, not saying anything, just being a wall I could lean my shoulder against when my legs threatened to give out. They stabilized him. By morning, Eli was sleeping, pale but breathing steady, and I sat in the chair beside his bed and didn't move for 6 hours straight, watching the rise and fall of his small chest like it was the only thing keeping the whole world turning. It was in the exhausted, raw hours after that night that I overheard the conversation that changed everything I thought I understood. I'd stepped out to get coffee I didn't even want, just to move my body somewhere, and I heard Thane's voice around the corner, low, talking to someone on the phone. His assistant, I'd learn later. He didn't know I was close enough to hear. I don't care what the board says, he was saying, voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him. We're not slow-walking this. I watched Callie die because nobody would move fast enough. I am not doing that again, not to that boy. Callie, his sister's name. I stood frozen against that wall, coffee cooling in my hand, and everything rearranged itself in my mind at once. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a rich man's passing whim. This was a man trying, desperately, quietly, to save the brother, the child. He never got to save the first time. Every dollar, every string he'd pulled, every sleepless night he'd spent in that hallway with me, it was Callie's name behind all of it. I didn't know whether to feel closer to him or further away. Part of me understood, with a kind of ache I can't fully describe, why he'd chosen us, chosen Eli. Part of me wondered if I was just a stand-in for a grief he'd never let himself finish. I confronted him about it later that night, my voice shaking with a mixture of gratitude and something that felt dangerously close to hurt. Were we ever real to you? I asked him. Or are we just a way to fix something you couldn't fix 11 years ago? He looked at me for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard from him before. You were real from the first night in that hallway, he said. Callie is why I noticed you. She's not why I stayed. I wanted to believe him. God help me, I did believe him, even with the antagonist in this story, the hospital board member who'd been fighting Thane's funding every step of the way, worried about liability, about precedent, about what it meant to let a billionaire's money dictate treatment decisions, even with him threatening to pull the plug on the whole procedure over politics I didn't understand and couldn't afford to lose. The board meeting happened 4 days before Eli's scheduled procedure. I wasn't allowed inside, but Thane told me everything afterward, and I've never forgotten a word of it. The hospital's chief board member, a man named Whitfield who'd spent the entire process treating my son's life like a legal liability instead of a heartbeat, argued that funding an unapproved, high-risk procedure for a single patient, however wealthy the donor, set a dangerous precedent. He talked about lawsuits. He talked about the hospital's reputation. Not once, Thane told me, his voice tight with anger, did the man say Eli's name. Thane stood up in that boardroom and did something I don't think he'd done in years. He stopped protecting his privacy. He told them about Callie. about watching his little sister die because the system moved too slowly and too carefully and too afraid of risk to save someone who was actually, urgently, running out of time. He told them that he had built a fortune specifically so he would never again have to sit powerless in a hallway while a doctor recited statistics at a family. And he told them that if they blocked this procedure over liability paperwork, he would make sure every news outlet in this country knew exactly why a 7-year-old boy didn't get the surgery that could have saved him. It wasn't a threat born of arrogance. I understood that later. It was the desperate, furious love of a man who had lost someone he couldn't save, standing in a room and refusing to lose someone else. The board approved the procedure that afternoon. I sat with Eli the morning of the surgery, his small hand in mine, and I told him everything I needed him to know, in case— no, I won't say the in case. I told him he was the reason my heart worked at all, that he had been enough, more than enough, every single day since he was born, and that no matter what happened in that operating room, he had already given me the best years of my life. "I'm not scared, Mommy," he told me, squeezing my hand with what strength he had left. "You're here, and Mr. Thane's here too." I looked up, and Thane was standing in the doorway, and something about the three of us in that moment, the boy who was my whole world, the man who'd walked into a hallway and refused to leave, and me, holding both of their hands without even realizing I'd reached for his, felt, for the first time in 7 years, like I wasn't doing this alone. They wheeled Eli into surgery at 6:42 in the morning. The wait that followed was the longest 4 hours of my entire life. Thane never left my side. He didn't try to fill the silence with false comfort. He just sat there, holding my hand in that hard plastic chair, both of us carrying our own private terror of the same 6-month countdown, one of us knowing exactly how this kind of waiting could end. At 10:58, the surgeon walked out, and for one endless second, before he spoke, I felt my whole heart stop along with the world. "He's stable," the surgeon said. "It went better than we hoped." I don't remember standing up. I remember Thane's arms catching me before my knees gave out, the same way they had that very first night. Except this time it wasn't grief holding me up. It was something closer to relief, so enormous it felt like drowning. I promised you 3 answers at the beginning of this story, and I intend to keep that promise. Why was a billionaire in the pediatric ICU that day? Because 11 years earlier, in a hallway just like the one where he found me, he'd lost his little sister to the same illness that was quietly killing my son, and he'd spent every year since trying to make sure no other family had to watch a countdown clock the way he had. What did I overhear that told me the truth? A phone call, raw and unguarded, where a man who never talked about his own pain finally let it slip. A sister's name, a decade-old grief, and a promise he'd made to himself that he would never again stand by and do nothing. And is my son still alive? 6 months after a doctor told me he had 6 months left? He is sitting 3 feet away from me right now, gluing gray rocks onto a shoebox for a school project, arguing that this particular rock is definitely older than the dinosaurs. His color is good. His energy is better than mine most days. His cardiologist calls him, without exaggeration, one of the strongest recoveries she's ever documented. Thane is still here too. I won't pretend that part of the story wrapped up as neatly and quickly as the medical part did. Trust, once broken by a lifetime of people leaving, doesn't rebuild itself overnight, even for a man who never once lied to me. But he stayed. Through the recovery, through the follow-up appointments, through every hard night when I needed someone to remind me that we'd made it through the worst one already. He never tried to replace what Eli's father walked away from. He simply showed up, again and again, until showing up became its own kind of promise. Eli calls him Mr. Thane still, mostly. Last week, for the first time, he called him something else. Quiet, almost testing the word out, and Thane's face did something I don't think I'll ever forget. I used to believe that love enough for 2 parents was the most I could ever give my son. I still believe I gave him everything I had, every single day, alone, and I will never regret a single sacrifice that got us here. But I've learned something else too, something I never expected to learn in a hospital hallway at the worst moment of my life. Sometimes, When you have already given everything, the universe sends someone to stand beside you anyway. Not to replace what you built, just to make sure you never have to carry it alone again. If you've made it this far, thank you for sitting with our story. If it moved you even half as much as it moved me to live it, let me know in the comments. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this one still to come.